The porch light was still on. Warm yellow light spilled across the front steps of the house Margaret Hale had lived in for 38 years, touching the edges of her old suitcase and the thin silver in her hair. Inside, behind the curtains, the living room glowed softly. The same lamp stood in the corner, the same lamp she used to switch on every evening before her husband came home. But tonight, Margaret was outside, locked out, and the house that had held her whole life no longer opened when she knocked. The November wind pushed dry leaves across the porch with a scratching sound. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Margaret gripped her phone with shaking fingers and knocked again, softer this time, as if gentleness might still be enough. No one came. She looked at her screen. One missed call to Ethan, two to Kyle. Then a text appeared. "This is what's best for everyone." Margaret stared at it until the words blurred. Inside that house were her dishes, her late husband's chair, the framed school pictures she never took down, and the small crack in the kitchen tile Ethan made when he was 9 trying to carry his father's toolbox. Inside was her life. Outside was Margaret, 70 years old, one suitcase. No plan. She called Ethan again. Voicemail. She called Kyle. This time he answered. "Mom, you need to stop." "Kyle," she whispered, "please open the door." "You can't stay there tonight." Margaret blinked into the cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this arrangement isn't working anymore." Arrangement. Not home, not family. Arrangement. "This is my house." "We've been over this," Kyle said, calm in the cruelest possible way. "You signed the papers." "What papers?" "The transfer papers after Dad's estate stuff." Margaret tightened her grip on the phone. She remembered envelopes, folders, signatures. Grief so heavy whole weeks had passed in a blur. "You told me that was routine paperwork." "It was paperwork," he said. "Call one of your friends, Denise maybe, but you can't stay there making a scene." Making a scene. As if standing on her own porch with a suitcase was performance instead of heartbreak. Then he hung up. Margaret stood there in silence, the porch light buzzing faintly overhead. A curtain shifted in the front window. Someone was watching. Still, no one opened the door. Across the street, her neighbor stepped out, saw Margaret, and quickly looked away. That hurt almost as much. Margaret bent, picked up her suitcase, and stepped off the porch. The wheels caught in the cracks of the sidewalk. The night smelled of chimney smoke and wet pavement. Halfway down the block, she stopped under a street lamp and looked back. The porch light was still on, as if home were there, as if she simply wasn't. She whispered it then, not even as a prayer, just something to hold on to, just make it to morning. 20 minutes later, she pushed through the glass door of a gas station beside a budget motel. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Burnt coffee hung in the air. An old refrigerator motor hummed at the back. Margaret set down her suitcase and asked the young clerk if there was a room available next door. "One left," he said. She handed over her card. He ran it once. Then again, his expression changed. "I'm sorry, ma'am, it's not going through." Margaret stared at the counter, at the scratches in the laminate, at her own reflection in the plexiglass shield. For one awful second, the room seemed to tilt. The young clerk looked up and really saw her. Not as a customer, not as a delay, as a woman who had just lost everything. "Ma'am," he asked softly, "are you okay?" Margaret opened her mouth. Nothing came. And that was the night a stranger noticed what her own sons refused to see. The clerk's name tag said Leo. He looked too young to be carrying that kind of concern in his face. Maybe 24. Tired eyes. Crooked name tag. A dark hoodie half-zipped against the cold each time the front door opened. "I'm okay," Margaret said automatically. Leo glanced at the declined card, then back at her. "You don't look okay." It was such a simple sentence that it nearly undid her. He poured a cup of coffee and set it in front of her. "It's bad," he admitted, "but it's hot." Margaret wrapped both hands around it. Burnt coffee. Powdered creamer, warmth against stiff fingers. You got someone you can call, he asked. Maybe she did, Denise. Old church friend. The kind of woman who always said, call me anytime, because neither of them ever imagined the call would come in the middle of the night. Margaret sat by the window, the dark parking lot shining under pale lamps, and pressed Denise's number before she could lose her nerve. Denise answered sleepy, then instantly alert. Margaret, what happened? I just need somewhere for tonight, Margaret said, a pause, then warmth. Of course. Come here right now. We'll figure it out in the morning. Morning. For the first time all night, relief moved through Margaret's chest. Leo watched her stand. You found someone, she nodded. Good, he said, and meant it. Denise opened the door before Margaret reached the steps. Warm air wrapped around her at once. The house smelled of soup, laundry detergent, and lemon dish soap. A lamp glowed in the living room. A folded blanket waited on the couch. Oh, honey, Denise said, and pulled her inside. For a moment, Margaret felt safe. She sat with a bowl of soup warming her hands while Denise listened. Margaret explained the locked door, the papers she didn't understand, the way Kyle had spoken to her like she was a burden to be managed. Then Denise's expression changed. It was slight, but Margaret saw it. Your boys called, Denise said quietly. Margaret stared at her. What? Yesterday afternoon, they said you might be reaching out. They said you've been confused since Harold passed, that things had gotten difficult. Confused, difficult. Margaret set the soup down before she dropped it. They called people, she asked. Denise looked miserable. I didn't know what to believe. They sounded worried. No, they sounded prepared, prepared enough to get there first, prepared enough to shape her story before she even arrived. Denise leaned forward quickly. You can stay tonight, of course. I don't know how involved I can get. Gary's worried about trouble, legal trouble, family drama, all of it. There it was, the soft refusal wrapped in sympathy. Margaret nodded before Denise even finished. I understand. And she did. That was the worst part. She understood people who wanted to be kind as long as kindness cost them nothing. A little later, Margaret stood in Denise's bathroom with the fan running overhead, loud enough to cover quiet crying. The room smelled of rose soap and bleach. She gripped the sink and stared at her reflection. Her face looked older than it had the day before. Not by years, by truths. Then through the door, blurred by the fan, she heard Denise whisper to her husband. I just don't want trouble. Margaret closed her eyes. Trouble. That was what she was now, not a widow, not a mother, not a woman with nowhere to go. Trouble. She rinsed her face with cold water, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door. By sunrise, she was gone. She left before anyone had to ask. The morning was cold and colorless. Margaret sat at a bus stop with her suitcase beside her, the metal bench freezing through her coat. Cars hissed over wet pavement. A child laughed while climbing into a minivan across the street. The ordinary sound of family made her look away. By 9 o'clock, she was standing inside a church outreach center that smelled of industrial cleaner, wet coats, and burnt coffee. The place was crowded. A baby cried somewhere down the hall. Volunteers moved quickly between folding tables and plastic chairs. A television in the corner played cheerful morning news to nobody. People filled out forms, coughed into sleeves, rocked strollers, stared at the floor. Margaret stood just inside the doorway feeling displaced, as if her life had been peeled away overnight and dropped her somewhere outside the map. Then a frightened voice cut through the room. That's not my bag. Where are my pills? An elderly woman in a faded green coat stood trembling beside a chair, oranges rolling from a torn grocery bag at her feet. A volunteer tried to calm her but only made her more upset. Before she had even decided to, Margaret moved. It's all right, she said gently. Let's find them. The woman looked at her. Who are you, Margaret? You work here. No, that seemed to help. Margaret picked up the oranges one by one, then knelt beside the woman and searched her purse only after receiving a stiff nod of permission. No pills. She checked a floral tote tucked under the chair. There they were. The woman's whole face softened with relief. "Would you like some water?" Margaret asked. A volunteer rushed over with a cup. Margaret unscrewed the cap because the woman's hands were shaking too hard. Then she found a phone number folded inside a church bulletin and asked the volunteer to call the woman's daughter immediately. It should have ended there, but it didn't. A little girl nearby started crying over dropped crackers while her mother struggled with a baby. Margaret handed her a new packet from a donation basket. A man couldn't read the fine print on a form. Margaret read it aloud. Someone needed a chair pulled over. Someone else needed a scarf retied. Someone needed a calm voice more than instructions. Margaret just kept seeing what needed doing and doing it, as if care were still her first language. By the time Leo walked into the outreach center after his shift, slightly out of breath from searching, Margaret was kneeling beside a little boy, tying his shoelace and telling him very seriously that dignity depended on a proper knot. Leo stopped in the doorway. The crowded room, the noise, the chaos, and Margaret in the middle of it, not waiting to be saved but helping hold everyone else together. He walked over slowly. "You know you're the one who needs help, right?" Margaret looked up. "So does everybody else." Leo shook his head like he didn't know what to do with a person like that. Later, when the room settled, Margaret sat in a plastic chair beside her suitcase. Leo handed her another coffee. "This one might be worse than last night's." "Then I'm prepared," she said. For the first time, he smiled. Then a volunteer brushed past too quickly, bumping Margaret's chair. Her purse slid to the floor, spilling everything out. Receipts, tissues, lipstick, reading glasses, and one cream-colored envelope. It slid across the tile and stopped at Leo's shoe. He bent and picked it up. On the front, typed neatly beneath a law office name, were the words, "Regarding the estate of Harold Hale." Leo looked at the envelope, then at Margaret. She didn't reach for it immediately. For the first time that morning, fear crossed her face. Not fear of the shelter, something older, something buried. Leo held it out carefully. "You want me to pretend I didn't see that?" Margaret took it with slow fingers. And in that moment, she understood something she had spent the whole night avoiding. Maybe this had not started at the locked door. Maybe it had started long before that. The outreach center kept moving around them, but for Margaret the room had gone still. She turned the envelope over in her hands. The corner was bent. The seal looked half broken. She remembered it now. One of many letters that arrived after Harold died, during those blurred weeks when sympathy cards, bank forms, utility bills, and legal papers covered every flat surface in the house. Ethan had handled most of it. That was what he always said. "Don't worry, Mom, I'm taking care of everything." At the time, that sounded like love. Now it sounded like strategy. "You never opened it?" Leo asked. Margaret shook her head. "I thought it was routine estate paperwork." "Because your son told you that?" She looked at him and answered with the honesty of someone too tired for pride. "Yes." Then memory began to return in pieces. Harold staring too long at unpaid bills Kyle had left on the kitchen table. Ethan sliding forms toward her after the funeral, one after another, always with a pen ready. "This is routine. This keeps things simple. Just sign here." She had signed because grief makes trust feel like relief, because her husband was gone, because her sons were her sons. Leo leaned back in his chair. "You think they lied to you?" Margaret lowered her eyes. "I think I didn't ask enough questions." "No," Leo said quietly. "I think the wrong people got used to you not asking." That landed, because it was true. She had paid Kyle's debts when his business failed, helped Ethan through a legal mess years earlier, covered shortfalls, car repairs, tuition, groceries, always quietly, always before anyone else knew. Every time she chose love over caution. Every time they learned the same lesson, that she would sacrifice before she would let them suffer. Then her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Margaret almost ignored it, but something in her chest tightened. She answered. "Hello." A man's voice came through, formal and measured. "Mrs. Margaret Hale, my name is Daniel Mercer. I'm an attorney with Mercer, Bell and Rains. I've been trying to reach you regarding the estate of your late husband." Margaret straightened. "I have a letter from your office," she said. "Yes, ma'am. That's why I'm calling. We reviewed the property file again after receiving transfer documents. I need to ask directly, are you currently residing in the family home?" Margaret's mouth went dry. "No. My son said I signed it over." There was a pause, not confusion, concern. "Mrs. Hale," he said carefully, "according to your husband's trust, you were granted lifetime residence rights. The home was protected. You were not to be removed from that property during your lifetime." Margaret stopped breathing. Leo leaned forward, eyes wide. The attorney continued. "Any transfer would have required your fully informed consent while preserving those rights. Based on the file we reviewed, that did not happen properly. So they couldn't do this," Margaret whispered. "Not lawfully." That hit harder than anger, because anger had already been there. This was confirmation. Her sons had not pushed her out in a moment of frustration. They had planned it, built it, used her grief like cover. Then Mr. Mercer said the one thing that changed pain into revelation. "Your husband also left a supplemental letter to be delivered if any dispute arose concerning the house or your care. Harold." Even now, his name seemed to steady the air around her. "What does it say?" she asked. "I'd rather place it in your hands directly," the attorney replied. "But I can tell you this. Your husband took specific steps to protect you if circumstances changed." If circumstances changed. Such careful words for betrayal. Mr. Mercer asked where she was and offered to meet her that same day. After the call ended, Margaret sat very still. Leah waited. Finally he asked, "What did he say?" Margaret lifted her head. Her eyes were wet, but her voice no longer sounded lost. "He said the house was never theirs to take." All this time she had told herself the same thing, just make it to morning. Now morning was here, and it was bringing the truth with it. By noon, Margaret was standing outside her own front gate again. Same house, same porch, same white trim and brass knocker. But this time she wasn't alone in the dark, begging to be let back into a life someone else had stolen. This time she stood in daylight beside Daniel Mercer, who carried a leather folder and the kind of calm authority that didn't need volume. Leo waited a few steps behind them on the sidewalk, pretending he hadn't insisted on coming. "Are you ready?" Mr. Mercer asked. No, but Margaret lifted her chin. "Yes," he knocked. Footsteps crossed the hardwood floor. The door opened. Kyle stood there first, surprise flashing across his face before calculation took over. "Mom," as if surprise were the right response, as if that word still deserved tenderness. Mr. Mercer stepped forward. "Kyle Hale, I represent the Hale Family Trust." Kyle's face changed. Behind him, Ethan appeared in the hallway, irritation fading the second he understood who stood on the porch. Mr. Mercer opened the folder. "Under the terms of Harold Hale's trust, Margaret Hale retains lifetime residency rights to this property. Any transfer or removal required her informed consent while preserving those rights. The documents filed after Mr. Hale's death do not meet that standard." Ethan tried first. "There has to be some misunderstanding." Margaret almost smiled. Misunderstanding, such a gentle word for something ugly. "There is no misunderstanding," Mr. Mercer said. "Mrs. Hale was not lawfully removable from this home." Kyle swallowed. Ethan stepped onto the porch, lowering his voice like privacy might save him. "We were trying to simplify things. Mom was overwhelmed." Margaret looked at him steadily. "I said I was overwhelmed by your father's funeral bills. I did not say I wanted to lose my home." Ethan went quiet. Then Mr. Mercer drew out one more document, a cream-colored letter. "There is also a supplemental statement left by Harold Hale to be read if a dispute ever arose concerning the property or Mrs. Hale's care." That changed everything. Not because of law, because of Harold. Mr. Mercer looked at Margaret. "Would you like me to read it?" She swallowed and nodded. The breeze moved lightly through the hedges. A wind chime sounded from a nearby porch. Across the street, her neighbor suddenly found great interest in watering a plant that clearly did not need it. Mr. Mercer unfolded the page. "If this letter is being read," he began, "then something has gone wrong in the one duty I cared about more than any other, that Margaret be safe in her own home." Margaret closed her eyes. He continued, "I have loved my sons all their lives. I have hoped more than once that time would teach them what gratitude could not. But hope is not a plan and love is not blindness." Kyle looked away. Ethan didn't move. "If either of them ever mistakes their mother's kindness for weakness or her grief for permission, then let this document do what I may no longer be here to do: protect her." Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth. Then came the line that broke the last of the illusion. "This house was built around Margaret's life, not theirs, and anyone who asks her to leave it without honor does not deserve the shelter of her silence." Silence followed. Real silence. Then Margaret looked at her sons. For a second she saw every age they had ever been layered over the men standing there now. Her heartbreak was real, but so was her clarity. "Mom," Kyle started. Margaret raised one hand. He stopped. "You left me outside," she said. "That was all. No speech. No shouting. No performance. Just the truth. And because it was simple, it hit harder than anything else could have." Neither son blocked the doorway when Margaret stepped forward. She crossed the threshold slowly. The house smelled the same cedar from the hallway closet, dust warmed by sunlight, the faint trace of coffee. Home. Harold's chair was still in the living room. The framed school pictures still lined the mantel. Entire decades of care stared back at her from the walls, while the men in the doorway tried to survive their own reflection. Mr. Mercer spoke quietly about corrective filings and immediate protection. Margaret listened, then turned back to her sons. This was where the story could have become revenge, but Margaret wanted something stronger than revenge: an end. "You will collect your things," she said, "and you will leave my house by tonight." No one argued. By late afternoon, bags were carried out. Keys were left on the kitchen table. The same neighbor who had looked away the night before now watched every trip to the car. Margaret opened the windows and let fresh air into every room. Later, when the house had finally gone still, she stood at the sink with a warm mug between her hands. Evening light turned gold across the yard. The porch chime sounded once. Leo waited near the gate, ready to leave without asking for thanks. Margaret stepped onto the porch. "You stayed," he shrugged. Seemed rude not to. For the first time in this story, Margaret smiled without forcing it. "You saw me when my own family didn't." Leo shook his head gently. "They saw you, they just didn't deserve you." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Maybe that was true. As the sun dropped lower, she went back inside and closed the front door. The lock clicked softly into place. Not rejection, protection. All night and then all day, she had carried one sentence through cold, shame, and truth. Just make it to morning. Now morning had come and gone, and what it brought was not rescue. It brought truth. For the first time in a long time, Margaret Hale did not have to make it to morning. Morning had finally made it to her.